Hello and welcome to part 2 of me trying to make a textured woven cushion using the Overshot method. You may want to go back and watch part 1 from a few weeks ago where I introduced the project, but either way, let's do a quick recap. So I'd spun up this Leicester Longwool into a sort of quite a loose 2-ply, it's quite slubby, but yeah, it's full of just texture and life really. I wanted to weave it in such a way where you could actually see all of that texture. You could see the curls, you could see the luster in the yarn, and that's why that's sort of what had led me to choosing the Overshot method, so that I could kind of have this as a surface texture, but then I wanted to have a solid base fabric to then make a cushion that still had structure to it. So in the last video, I sort of had introduced the project. I'd done my sampling and had come up with my weaving plan, you know, what were the dimensions and things like that, and I was ready to start on the warp, but I decided I'll just go and have a lunch break and just think about it, just check I hadn't forgotten anything. And now we're back, so that was about 3 weeks ago. But yeah, the reason it took so long is that I actually ran out of wool partway through weaving the project. So I did get the warp ready and I was weaving that same day, the next day. And then yeah, I ran out of wool and then it started snowing. So that kind of, delayed things, and then I just got distracted on other projects. But I am pleased to say I have now finished the weaving. You can see my loom is empty. So yeah, I thought I would give you an update on how the weaving went. I definitely learned a lot in this project. There's quite a few things that I think I would do differently next time. So I'm going to share all of that with you. But yeah, I think we're ready to get stuck in. So my first challenge was actually with the yarn that I chose for my warp. I'm not actually sure that this West Yorkshire Spinners Jacob's Fleece DK is particularly good for weaving. When I was preparing the warp, I realised just how bouncy the yarn is. Depending on how much you stretch it when you're using the warping board, my path, which I went for a 1.5 metre path, could end up actually being about 1.35 metres of unstretched warp. But I feel like I'm not really experienced enough to know sort of how to handle this, what to do about it. So I just tried to do my best to keep the tension consistent at least. But yeah, I mean, there were so many unknowns that I just had to kind of go for it. It didn't make getting it on the loom easy either. Everything felt so bouncy, and it felt hard to know if the warp was actually being consistently stretched over the total width. For reference, the only other warp yarn that I've used so far is the Woolly Knits British Wool 4-ply cone, which has relatively little stretch compared with this one. I love when you get to this stage of the project. It's like everything else before this feels a little bit like a chore and a little bit stressful, because there's so much that you could get wrong, and if you do get it wrong, then it's quite a lot of work to try and resolve it. But yeah, when you get to this point, it's like, right, we're so close now to actually starting to weave. I'm finally weaving, yay! Although once again, I am questioning the use of this West Yorkshire Spinners Jacob's DK yarn. I'm really struggling to figure out how much yarn to put in for each pick. If I just pulled it through under tension, then all that elastic energy in the yarn would definitely bring the width of the cloth in too much. But trying to figure out like just the right amount of extra yarn to put in to try and undo that tension is just really tricky. It also feels quite sticky, so even when I tried making lots of little mountains, if I put in too much excess, then I could see it was sort of like rippling in the fabric. Oh, it's just a bit gross and took me a little while to get used to. Time for another challenge, the buttonholes. So I'd entertained a few different closure options for the cushion, but when I realised that I could actually make my buttonholes at the weaving stage, I got very excited and had to just give it a go. It's a fairly simple concept. You just break up your weaving into multiple sections. You keep weaving line by line, but use a different length of weft for each section, so they build up separately. I wasn't sure how long to make these slits, but 2.5 centimetres, 1 inch felt about right. I also wasn't sure how they would change in the finishing process, so I wasn't going to be too particular about how big they were. One thing that I noticed quite quickly though was that the new selvage edges that I was creating felt quite loose, and that the buttonholes, if they were left like this, would probably not be strong enough to sort of hold the shape. So I decided I'd probably need to do something once the cloth was actually off the loom to reinforce them, but that's fine. I've got a few hand sewing techniques up my sleeve that I knew I could use and try. Now the real fun can start, the actual overshot weaving. From my sampling, I knew that I liked the overshots to be going over about 5 warp threads. It's about the same as 1 centimetre. This really made the handspun yarn pop out in my opinion. Now my loom only has 4 shafts, so I couldn't actually use these to help me achieve the overshots. So I had to just pick them with a large needle. This meant that it was very time consuming, but we'll talk about that later in the timing and numbers section. It was so satisfying to see the first section build up. It was working out just as I was hoping, and I felt like the Leicester Longwool was just really, really singing. From my sampling, I knew I wanted to use this project to experiment with different overshot weaving patterns. From this, I might then choose just one of those patterns for future projects, or maybe I'll just enjoy having all of these texture changes all in one cloth. I tried to embrace this creative aspect of the project, dreaming up different textures and trying to make a cohesive design as one section moved into the next. I've got to admit, this is a little bit foreign to me, but there were moments of creative joy, but sometimes you just want to weave. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I had to stop working on this project as I ran out of the West Yorkshire spinners yarn. It's a real shame because I think I could have got this project done fairly quickly, and also my brain isn't amazing at like retaining information, so it was slightly challenging trying to pick it back up again. But I had been taking notes on how I was doing each of the textures and in what order they were in, so this really helped when I came back to it and I was trying to then plan what to do for the next sections. Before I knew it, I'd run out of warp. I was supposed to be weaving for 95 centimetres. Well, I was aiming for a finished cloth of 95 centimetres, but because I didn't know what my shrinkage rate was going to be, I just decided to aim for 95 centimetres on the loom. But it started getting tricky to weave at around 87 centimetres. I managed to squeeze a few extra centimetres out, but next time I'm definitely going to give myself a lot more warp. My loom wastage estimate was also off, so yeah, next time I'll definitely increase that number as well. I don't normally do anything on the loom to finish my cloth. I tend to just cut it off and knot the fringe, but I didn't really want a fringe this time, so I needed something to secure my weaving, at least temporarily. So I tried hemstitching for the first time. It took a few attempts to get it right, but then it became very satisfying, and I wish I'd done it at the beginning now as well. It's always really exciting, this stage where you get to unroll your cloth off the loom. It's a really awesome feeling to just see what you've made, especially when it comes out like as well as you'd hoped. Again, I wanted to at least temporarily secure my weaving, so I decided to just knot my warp threads from the start, and I left the stuff that I used to spread it out in the weft just until I figured out what I was going to do with it next. Now we all know that I'm trying to be a better spinner and weaver and actually take notes. So I wanted to measure my cloth again now that it's off the loom, so that I could see how much shrinkage I'd had using this West Yorkshire spinners as the warp and the weft. So I had been aiming for 40 by 95 centimetres. I've already explained that I couldn't achieve the full length. On the loom it was measuring 91 centimetres, but off the loom it was more like 86 centimetres. The width I knew was going to be less, both on and off the loom. The actual width was 37 centimetres. I knew I wanted to do a proper job at fulling this cloth so that the base fabric would act as a proper solid bit of fabric, giving the cushion structure as well as keeping the filling secure inside. I watched a fantastic set of videos on the School of Sweet Georgia site. This is a learning platform that I pay for monthly. And yeah, they had a video series all about fulling. And it turns out there's a lot more to it than you might think. So I started by scouring the cloth in the bath with just a little bit of gentle washing up liquid. I was being more aggressive than I have ever been in the water, but I believe this is sort of how you start the fulling process. I then removed the excess water in a towel, and then came the fun bit. Now, doing slam balls in the gym used to be one of my favourite exercises, so this was right up my street. You're basically just throwing the cloth onto a hard surface, which I think shocks the fibre and makes the threads move into the place of least resistance. The more you do it, the more cohesive the fabric becomes. I kept checking how the weave was behaving. The way to do this is by trying to poke your fingernail through the weave and see whether you can get through. There wasn't a huge difference, but there was some. Now, it might be that I'm not doing this method quite right. It is my first time trying to follow the instructions, but it could also be the yarn. Every yarn will behave a little bit differently to this method, and I'm suspicious from working with this yarn before in knitting projects that it doesn't have a sort of a noticeable bloom when it gets washed. But I was happy with the handle of the cloth that I ended up with, so now I just need to wait for it to dry.